Welcome you all. I want to welcome you all here today from across the country. I'm Antron Watson with AARP Massachusetts. Today, you will hear about Louisa May Alcott and her sister May. First, I just want to thank Beth Williams, the tourist manager for the town of Concord. As she has really played a big part in this collaboration that AARP Massachusetts and the Concord Visitor Center have had was putting on this our first local history series, and it's been a great series so far. So we want to thank the Visitor Center and specifically Beth for helping us pull this off. Today's webinar really wraps up our Concord History series. All of our recordings from the past events are on the AARP Massachusetts YouTube page, so you can find other recordings there, as well as, become a follower. Follow us. We're always putting up different events throughout the year. So we offer this webinar to really keep your brain stimulated and to encourage exploration and learning. For lots of great resources about brain health, you can always visit AARP's Brain Health Resource Center at aarp.org/brainhealth. Additionally, you can find these and other offerings at the AARP Virtual Community Center at aarp.org/VCC. Brain health and keeping your mind active is important to you. And I also know that many of you enjoy travel. Maybe the presenters today will inspire you to visit Concord in the coming, days, months. Summer's right around the corner. But Massachusetts, they're really visiting Concord, Massachusetts, especially as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution next year. So just a little bit about AARP. AARP really maintains a deep focus on the health, financial security, and personal fulfillment of people 50 and over and their families. And you'll find that reflected in our offerings and the resources and in our advocacy. In every state and the U.S. Capitol, AARP is advocating for the issues that affect you most. We're fighting to protect your hard-earned Medicare, Social Security benefits. We're urging Congress to lower prescription drug prices, support family caregivers, and stop scams and shut down fraud. We'll keep fighting to protect your interest here in Massachusetts and across the country. So wherever you are, you can find your local state office by going to aarp.org/local. This will help you stay informed about what's happening in your backyard. So as you think of questions you may want to ask our speakers today, please use the Q&A feature across the bottom of the screen. It's a little different from the chat. So just make sure you get to the right one, Q&A, and that helps us keep track of the questions and making sure we're answering as we get to that point of the program. We left a good amount of time at the end to make sure we're getting to as many questions as possible. But following the program, a brief survey will also be sent out. So please take the time to complete that survey. That lets us know what we're doing good, what we can do better, and what programming to bring to you all in the future. In addition to that survey, you will receive a copy or a link to this recording to watch it again because this is going to be a great story. Honestly, I think you've heard more than enough from me, but let me tell you a little bit more about our presenters, and then I will turn it over to them. So we have Stephanie Cloutier, who is an interpretive guide with the Concord Visitor Center, using her performing skills to bring history to life for school groups and individuals. She and Amy have developed a living history piece that showcases the relationship between Louisa May and May Alcott, Between Us Sisters, which they perform for groups in the greater Boston area. Now, Amy Cole has been a longtime interpretive guide working for major historical landmarks, including the Richard H. Dreyfus Museum and Glessner House in Chicago. Currently, she is an interpretive guide with the Concord Visitor Center, where she has led, developed, and researched content for the various historical walking tours offered, including the history of the indigenous people of Concord. Whew, I have said that's it. I'll turn it over to you two. So Stephanie and Amy, please take it away.
Thank you, Antron. I do want to say that that the fall is also an excellent time to visit Concord. So if you are especially from outside of this, the New England area, that is a beautiful time to visit. So the weather's perfect, the colors are gorgeous. So please come. At any rate, we're going to start. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Stephanie and this is Amy. And we're here today to talk about the sisterly relationship between Louisa May Alcott and her youngest sister, May. So I'm going to share my screen so we can, yay, look at that. Very excited when I can do this. Amy and I are both tour guides for the town of Concord, which is where the Alcott sisters lived. And we typically do tours around town that talk about the history of Concord being the first inland settlement in Massachusetts, the site of the first major battle of the Revolutionary War, and it's where a literary revolution took place in the mid-1800s. It's still a major literary town, drawing authors such as presidential biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin, novelists Alice Hoffman and Gregory Maguire to live here. So it still continues to be a draw for literary kind of people. But a few years ago, we were asked to create a living history piece that would explore the relationship between well-known author Louisa May Alcott and her less well-known, but highly accomplished youngest sister, May. In the 1800s, Concord was home to Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who was the writer of the novel of the book Walden, not a novel, a real book. Emerson was the catalyst for bringing people to Concord who he felt would fit well with the literary society that he was looking to create. Among those was Nathaniel Hawthorne and Bronson Alcott, who brought his young family here when Louisa was just 8 years old. May had not yet been born and was in fact the only Alcott sister to be born in Concord. They first moved into a house here in Concord. So first I'm going to show you, oh wait. Oh, look at that.
Ah, there we are.
There's me and Amy performing as Louisa and May Alcott. And that actually is taking place in the Thoreau room of the Colonial Inn here in Concord, which was an inn that was built in 1716 and was the site of the doctor who had a surgery there on that morning of that battle. So just a little something to know. They first moved into a house that they called the Hillside, where Louisa had her own room. She had a door where she could run outside. Those were literally the happiest days of her life. That's the house where most of the events that she later wrote about in Little Women took place. She wrote the novel years later when she was living at Orchard House, and she actually set the story there. The Alcotts were neighbors with both the Hawthornes and the Emersons, and they were good friends with Henry David Thoreau, they were allowed free reign in the Emersons' library. They explored the local forest with Henry David Thoreau, who named it Fairyland for them. Kids today still call it Fairyland. They played games with the Hawthorne children, and Louisa wrote stories for the Emerson children. The Alcotts were actually very unusual for the time in that they encouraged their daughters to be very progressive, to follow their passions, and to be independent women, which was really unusual at that time because most women were raised to be wives and mothers and to take care of their households. As a result, Louisa would really pursue her career as a writer, and May would pursue her art.
So May is the youngest of the Alcott daughters, born in 1840, and the only Alcott daughter to be born in Concord. She was originally named after her mother, Abigail May Alcott, and she went by various iterations, Abby May, but finally decided on May in her late teens, and it was May ever since.
Sorry, kids.
Now, most people think they know May, or they still got Louisa.
I'm just going to leave Louisa there.
Leave her there.
Now.
All right. Well, most people think they know May, or they think they know her, but by Louisa's best-selling book, Little Women, as the character Amy, which happens to be the anagram for May. And Louisa based the March sisters in her book on her real sisters. Anna, the oldest sister, is Meg, followed by Louisa as Jo. Then there's Elizabeth or Beth or Lizzie, and finally May as Amy. Now, May did not like her portrayal of her character in the book. And as you may recall, Amy was the vain and self-centered one, certainly preoccupied with her looks. And she would go as far in the story as putting a clothespin on her nose in order to reshape it. May actually wrote a letter to a good family friend, Alf Whitman, and expressed her displeasure with this portrayal. And she said, "That stupid, silly Amy character." Now, because the characters were based on her real sisters, May was genuinely concerned that people would actually think that of her. The family did call her Little Raphael, and that's because, well, that was one of May's favorite artists, but it also, more importantly, was because she was a talented young artist at a young age, and she was always known for drawing flowers and figures, and many of which she drew on her own bedroom walls at the home called Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts. The name Orchard House came up with that name was their father, Bronson Alcott, for all the apple orchards on the property. Now, most don't know this, but May did the illustrations for the first edition of Little Women.
So let me show you those. Let me just backtrack a second here.
Okay.
Because I went through these kind of fast. So this is Ralph Waldo Emerson on the left here and Henry David Thoreau on the right. And I just want to point out Emerson because we'll talk about him a little bit later and the crush that Louisa had on him. So take a look at that handsome guy. And this is a very young portrait of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was also very dashing in his own way, but incredibly shy. So I will just say that. Here are the Alcott parents. You've got Bronson on the right and Abba on the left. And this is the hillside, which we will also talk about in a little bit. This is the very first house that they lived in here in Concord. And it's the house where the events of Little Women took place. Here is the Orchard House. Right to a picture taken around that time, maybe a little later, originally thought to be a teardown, but Bronson Alcott saw it differently. Here is the lovely May.
Here's May.
Look at that. Could you imagine putting a clothespin on that nose?
No,
I'm just saying. So here's the illustrations.
Sure. All right. So so most people don't know this, but May did the illustrations for the first edition of Little Women. And some critics said her figures were anatomically incorrect. And if you look at this picture, you can see the heads are larger in proportion to the body. And she would need some formal training. She had studied with some prominent Boston artists, such as Dr. William Rimmer, William Morris Hunt, and others. But ultimately, May would need to go to Europe to get the best education. And that's because in America at this time, women were not offered the same opportunities as men to study the anatomy, which is very crucial to becoming a successful artist. May would finally get that opportunity. She recalls the first time she went to Europe with Louisa in 1870. They had an opportunity to travel with their wealthy friend, Alice Bartlett, who's there on the left. May had always dreamed of going to Europe and finally had her chance. She recalls in her writing that she was mesmerized by the scenery and she wished that she had the skills of a plein air painter able to capture all the color that she was seeing. And she had her sketch pad with her and she would draw and sketch the places they visited. And those drawings would end up accompanying their letters that they would send home to their family. Sort of like photographs today, right?
Right, because they didn't have photographs. So this is how you would document what it is that you were seeing and send them home with the letters.
Yeah, absolutely. So while they were there, they got news of their sister Anna's
her husband, John Pratt. He had died unexpectedly. They'd only been married for about 10 years. And so it was really kind of shocking to the two sisters who were there in Europe. So Louisa made plans to go back right away. She had promised when they were first married that she would take care of Anna and their two little boys should anything happen to John. So because of that, she sat down and wrote Little Men before she sailed home, which I just think is fascinating because that was her plan for making money. It takes Louisa 12 days to make the voyage, during which time her cabin mate comes down with smallpox. So it's a bit of a perilous journey. And when she arrives in Boston, her father and her publisher are there to pick her up in a carriage that is bedecked with a poster announcing the publication of Little Men. 50,000 copies had been sold in advance.
It's amazing. So May would end up staying in Europe. She found a watercolor teacher. And at this point, she began her serious study in Paris, London, and in Rome. Of course, none of this would have been possible without Louisa's financial assistance, and specifically the money that Louisa received from the publication of Little Women in 1868. Now, I find this a bit ironic, given May's strong dislike for the character Amy, but it was Louisa's book, Little Women, which allowed her to study and travel back and forth to Europe 3 separate times.
You know, so the initial inspiration for Little Women was the theatricals that the girls would put on when they were children,
right,
living at the hillside. So they would actually climb the stairs, they would act out Pilgrim's Progress, and they would climb the stairs to overcome their different vices. So,
right. So Pilgrim's Progress, just to give you a little background on that, it's a religious allegory, and it was written by John Bunyan. It was published in 1678 and another series in 1684. And at one time, this book was second only to the Bible in popularity. And it's all about this pilgrim overcoming his sins. And he's climbing in the hill to the celestial city, trying to achieve that. So Louisa actually used this as a vehicle in her book, and giving the women, her sisters, their obstacles to overcome. So Meg is vanity, Jo temper, Beth fear, and Amy selfishness. And this vehicle, this Pilgrim's Progress, would have been known to people. So it was quite clever that she used that. And it also happened to be Bronson Alcott's favorite book. So it all kind of tied in, and cleverly it was used by Louisa as the vehicle in the story.
right. But before that, they actually would do these theatricals at home. They would have very elaborate sets and costumes that they kept upstairs in the second floor.
Right. So when they were each house they lived at, they would do these theatrical productions. So when they were living at the hillside, their theater was the barn. And that hillside is also very famous today. It's known as the Wayside Home of Authors, because the Alcotts lived there, the Hawthornes lived there.
Let me see if I can go back.
Harriet Lothrop, a third author, lived there, who wrote a series of children's books called The 5 Little Peppers and How They Grew. So when they were living at the Orchard House, then they were next door. They did their plays in the dining room. That was their stage. And then they would invite their friends and family in the parlor to watch. And during this performance at the Orchard House, they would have a back stairs that ran upstairs to May's room. And they had this big trunk that they kept all their costumes in, which they all made. Actually, May painted the sets.
Yeah, it was a very collaborative
event. So they ran upstairs, all the costumes were out there, ready for their various costume changes.
And Louisa and Anna would write most of the scripts. Louisa wrote most of the scripts. Anna would also write them, and then they would act them out. In fact, Anna and Louisa were 2 of the original founders of a theater in Concord called the Concord Dramatic Union. It is the precursor to the current community theater in town called the Concord Players, who actually were established in 1919 as a direct descendant of the Concord Dramatic Union, and in fact pay homage to their benefactress every 10 years by performing a Little Women script. So I think that that's kind of fun. It was while they were performing, Anna was performing out a love scene from The Loan of a Lover, that she and her future husband John met and fell in love, and then were married at Orchard House in 1860.
And it also happened to be Bronson and Abba's 30th wedding anniversary.
Louisa wrote that at the time that at the wedding, Emerson gave Anna a kiss, and she thought that honor would make even matrimony endurable, for he is the god of my idolatry and has been for years. You remember that picture I showed you earlier? You see what kind of hunk he was. For a time, Louisa actually considered a life in the theater, both writing plays and performing, but her mother really discouraged her. She knew how hard it was to make a living that way. She wanted her daughters to be able to be independent, and she dissuaded her from it. But still, she wrote and sold a number of plays before she wrote the novel that would make her famous. So when her publisher approached her about writing a novel about young girls, Louisa's first response was to say, I don't know anything about young girls. I don't know what to write. Then she realized she actually resisted him for about 10 years. And then she realized she really needed the money. So, and that was really important to her. So she thought back to those days that when they were living at the hillside and decided to write that. And she decided to structure it on Pilgrim's Progress because it was a story that most people knew. It was their father's favorite. He called his girls his little pilgrims. But that's really where the similarity ends. She did base the March children and the March family on the Alcotts, but all of the other characters were completely made up. She also, there was two different guys who were the inspiration for Laurie. And I think it's very interesting that one of them in particular, I guess, had a stronger influence on Laurie. And she, years later, sent him a check, I think for $7,000 to thank him, just out of the blue. And which is a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money. And we don't know if he ever said anything about it, but apparently he cashed the check. So he must have been pretty okay with it. So even as she decides to write this story and base it on her family, she knows that her family is too poor and really too progressive to be relatable to most people. So she changes a number of the facts. So for example, in the story, father goes off to the Civil War. He becomes very ill, and Marmee has to go bring him home. And in order to raise the train fare for this, Jo cuts off and sells her hair. Right. So in real life, it's Louisa who goes off to the war. Bronson was a pacifist. He would not have gone off to the war. She volunteers as a nurse. She develops typhoid pneumonia after 6 weeks, and her father has to come and bring her back. Her fever is so high that they cut off all of Louisa's hair, 4.5 feet of it.
Right. And so Louisa would use these real life stories, but apply them differently to other characters. So as Stephanie said, she would, in this real life, she had her own hair, had to be cut off because of her illness. But in the book, Jo cuts her hair and sells it to pay for the train fare. And then she makes Amy, again, about vanity and selfishness. And she says about Jo that Jo has lost her one great beauty, when in fact it was Louisa that felt badly about this and felt it was her greatest asset. So she's very clever about how she uses the real life stories and weaves them in a different way that's suited to the characters in the story.
It's true. While they were living at the hillside also as little girls, their parents were would take in fugitive slaves. So this was a cause that Louisa was very familiar with. And it really made her want to do something to help the cause of enslaved people. Later, when the Civil War began, she knew that she couldn't enlist. She was female. So instead, she volunteered as a nurse in the Union Hospital, taking care of 42 Black soldiers. While she is there, their neighbor, Mr. Hawthorne, comes over and has tea with her mother and gives her mother some advice that he asks her to pass on to Louisa, saying, saying that she must take note of the characters and incidents of hospital life and by and write them out so she could make her fortune.
And that's I think that's kind of interesting that the
yes.
fortune word was used specifically because Louisa at age 15 had written in her journal, she didn't care what she did, act, teach, write. And so she didn't know what it took. She was going to be rich, famous, and happy. So at a young age, Louisa knew she had to be the breadwinner in this family.
Yes, yes. So she's very surprised because hospital sketches, she writes these up as hospital sketches, she calls them, and they become very popular. She says, I wrote topsy-turvy notes on whatever was at hand, and I cannot believe that people found this so fascinating, which is kind of hilarious. She also had as a benefactor, or they had as a benefactor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So let me see if I have his house here.
There it is.
There's Anna and John Pratt. Yay. So this is Emerson's house. And Emerson had a wonderful library. And he allowed the Alcott girls to come to his library whenever they wanted. So she actually did, she being Louisa, she read everything that she could.
Right. And May, too, was allowed access as well, but she went for a different reason. She went to study and copy classical works of art that were in the library. And May actually would become a respected copyist, and especially of Turner paintings. So let me talk a little bit about what a copyist really means and how it meant for women at this period. So women were not thought to be able to create an original work of art, but it was probably acceptable for them to reproduce a work of art. And it's a real double-edged sword with women, because if you are a respected copyist, meaning a copyist of great works like Turner, for a woman, that's important too, because it's a sought-after skill and it paid well. And that was certainly the case for May. So it really has this kind of double-edged sword. Being a copyist doesn't sound very something to aspire to, when in fact, for women at this period, it was also a way to be noticed and get yourself into the art world and be recognized. So that's what she did. And she was particularly known for copying Turner very well. In fact, I couldn't even tell the difference. I was going to label these and say, well, this was May's work versus Turner. And to be quite honest, I couldn't tell a difference. So she was very, very, very skilled at this.
Very talented. So it's at this library that Louisa finds Goethe's Conversations with a Child. And she writes later that she imagined herself a Bettine to Emerson's Goethe. She was making him her Goethe. So she wrote letters to Emerson that she thankfully never sent. She sat in a tall cherry tree at midnight, singing to the moon till the owls scared her to bed. She left wildflowers on the doorstep of her master, and she sung Minion's song in very bad German beneath his window. Years later, when she told Emerson about this, he begged to see the letters, and she was just grateful that she had burned them. She did write that we were still the pathetic little family. She had been writing and selling stories and plays for many years, all of which helped to keep the family afloat. But it wasn't until the success of Little Women that she was able to pay off all of her family's debts and secure their future, because it was her goal to be famous and rich someday so she could make things easier for the old folks. Those are her words.
Yes. And May also had her dreams for when she would become rich and famous. And she said, quote, I shall found a school for the indigent artists and aspiring young students, as Rosa Bonheur had done in Paris for girls under 20 years of age. And May worked very hard teaching art classes in Boston and in Concord. And in 1875, May's dream would become a reality with the opening of an art center in Concord, Massachusetts. And she would receive a nice mention in the local paper, which I'll read. We cannot fail to enlarge our ideas, at least upon the subject of art, under the guidance of and encouragement so heartily tendered by Miss May Alcott, to whose untiring energy and disinterestedness we are indebted for all, the origin of the plan, the use of the studio itself, and everything it contains. And May's mother was very proud of her and called her, and is quoted as calling her a noble girl.
Yeah.
Yes. And their mother always supported their dreams and in fact told them, let the world know you're alive. And all the girls were encouraged to pursue their dreams and aspirations.
She was a very progressive woman herself. She was one of the first social workers, right?
That's right.
She worked in Boston for a time. She was helping families poorer than they were. And believe me, the Alcotts were incredibly poor. And she also asked Louisa and May's father to marry her, which was a little unusual at the time.
Right. And Bronson couldn't even answer her. And instead, he had to show her his journal entries where he had written his feelings about her. It perhaps for the Alcotts is not too surprising, given that both parents believed that keeping a journal was the best way to express one's feelings. And they also required their daughters to keep a journal as well.
And so they did keep journals, and their parents made notes in them. So their parents didn't just read them, they made notes in them, which is kind of fascinating. Just a little side note too, the Hawthornes, Nathaniel and his wife Sophia kept a joint journal. So I just want you to imagine that if you and your partner were keeping a joint journal. So they would lead, the parents would read the girls' journals, and Marmee, Louisa says that Marmee left notes in hers. Now, Louisa used hers to better herself. She was trying to improve her character. She was trying to get control of her temper. She writes a lot about trying to be a better person. And her mother would write notes in there encouraging her in this. Her father, however, had a lot of issues with the fact that Louisa was writing mostly about herself instead of others, as her sister Anna did, because Anna was held up as the paragon of virtue and modesty, and I think that irked Louisa somewhat.
It definitely did. Now, Bronson's kind of interesting because he's progressive, yes. However, he still had this idealized version of how women should be. And Anna was the only one of the sisters who chose the domestic life, a more traditional role. And so, it's interesting to me that he still had that vision for his girls, but he definitely was supportive of Louisa and her writing, but he definitely was more critical of Louisa as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Louisa also felt that May got away with a little bit too much and felt that that perhaps their parents were not quite as hard on her in terms of her journal, and she didn't have to be as strict.
Yeah, sometimes I think May probably got a little, more of a ride on that. But Marmee, as they called their mother, did in fact leave a note in May's journal and scolded her for letting it lapse and reminded her of the importance of keeping a journal to serve as a permanent record of the details of life. Now, May recalls a time when their father came back from a months-long lecture tour with only $1 to show for it. So Bronson was a dreamer, but he was not good at being a family provider. And their mother had said, well, we should just be happy to have him back. Their mother had always been an unfailingly loyal to Bronson and his beliefs, even when his ideals were not always ideal for the family. And was certainly the case with Fruitlands, as it was called. And this is a picture in Harvard, Massachusetts, where Bronson Alcott tried his utopian experiment along with Charles Lane from England, an educator, and they christened this Eden, they called it, Fruitlands. It was incredibly severe living. The experiment meant that you couldn't use any animal products, not even oil for heating or, for lighting at night. No cotton used because they felt that was contributing to the labors of enslaved people. They wanted you to have no stimulants, tea or coffee. It was a vegan diet. It's just sounded absolutely horrific. And unfortunately, Bronson and Charles Lane would, go off and philosophize, and leaving the girls and Marmee, their mother, to fend for themselves and do all the work. And she finally put her foot down and would take the girls away from that and go find a place to live until they all would join up again. But the experiment only lasted for 7 months, June of 1843 to January of the next year. But Louisa really brings everything down to reality. And this is an actual quote. She actually wrote a book called Transcendental Wild Oats, a whole fictionalized account of the Fruitlands experiment. And I love this quote. So, this prospective Eden consisted of an old red farmhouse, a dilapidated barn, many acres of meadowland, and a grove. 10 ancient apple trees were all the chaste supply which the place afforded, but in the firm belief that plenteous orchards were soon to be evoked from their inner consciousness, these sanguine founders had christened their domain Fruitlands. So I love that. I think that's great.
They were not farmers, apparently. So,
and they were ill prepared.
They were very ill prepared. And one of the reasons that Marmee, this was the only time that Marmee really put her foot down, because otherwise she really adored Bronson. She had to love him because he clearly wasn't supporting the family. But the part of the reason is that they were starving. They were starving. Her girls were starving, and she just could not stand by and watch that. It's also one of the reasons that later, when they moved to Orchard House, that Louisa called it apple slump, because it was for the slumped over apple trees that were on the grounds of the Orchard House. So, but it's also the name of her favorite dessert.
That's
apple
right.
Slump.
And if you go to the Orchard House today, you'll see they put little apples on top of the on the door there. But I just want to share this one quote. This is from Louisa too. You know, about her father, or a philosopher. A man up in a balloon with his family and friends holding the ropes which confine him to earth and trying to haul him down. I just love that.
So this is a picture of Lizzie, who was the third sister, and who did not actually ever live at the Orchard House. She died before they moved to the Orchard House.
Right. And Louisa would always refer to Lizzie as our little angel of the house, you know, so even though she didn't live there. And I think it's surprising for many people that to find that Beth didn't live in the Orchard House, because the book, of course, the whole setting is with all the girls there. But that is the one exception that really she never made it to that house.
So I will actually read this one quote that I wasn't going to read before, but
okay.
Louisa wrote in her journal about Lizzie's death, because I think it's kind of interesting. She says, a curious thing happened just as she died. And I will tell it here, for Dr. G said it was a fact. A few moments after the last breath came, as Mother and I sat silently watching the shadow fall on the dear little face, I saw a light mist rise from the body and float up and vanish in the air. Mother's eyes followed mine, and when I said, "What did you see?" she described the same light mist. Dr. G said it was the life departing visibly. So I think that's kind of interesting. And sad. It's sad that she was not a part of that.
But Orchard House was their final house that they all lived, because the Alcotts moved like, what, 30 times?
They moved 30 times in 20 years.
Yeah.
So, and at the time that Lizzie died, and then Anna and John were getting married, and Louisa felt very strongly that she was losing two sisters. And she, who had had a little bit, I think, of a contentious relationship with her sister, May, because they were very different. There was enough space between them that Louisa felt that her life had been a little stricter than May's, that she really made an effort then to become closer to this one sister. And I think they had a lot of real similarities in that they were very career oriented. They had artistic passions that they both were following and both were very much a part of. But at any rate, in 1875, you have the Centennial happen here in Concord. So it's 100 years since that shot heard around the world. And they decide that they're going to have, a whole Centennial celebration down at the North Bridge and put up a new statue. And Louisa actually wrote an article in a woman's magazine about it afterwards. And she says, the whole thing was an insult to the women of the revolution. As I looked about me, it was impossible to help thinking that there should have been a place for the four mothers of the revolution, the great granddaughters of Prescott, William Emerson, John Hancock, and Dr. Ripley, as well as the women who cut the immortal cartridges that had fired the shot heard round the world, sewed the ancient banner that was to be put on display, and that quartered, fed, and inspired the soldiers. It seemed to me that the men of Concord had missed a grand opportunity of imitating those whose memory they had met to honor. So Louisa and these other women invite themselves. They assemble on the steps of the courthouse. They were promised escorts, but none came, so they marched themselves down to the bridge. This is a photo of this group on that day. The women who were not invited coming down, they stood listening to hours of speeches, towards the end of which the platform on which the orators were standing began to collapse. It was held up by one lone woman. So the men then invited them up on the platform, and the women sweetly declined, saying that their platform was not strong enough to hold them. So that evening they went to the ball. They had plenty of escorts, and she says, why not? This is exactly the frivolity that they felt women were meant for. So
yeah, and May had her own version of that in the art world. You know, she would always say that women were not taken seriously when they were pursuing an art education. She found in Europe the classes were more expensive, less rigorous than the men's. But in America, you know, a woman couldn't even study the figure from life. That's why she initially went to Europe to study. But she determined that living in Europe, though, she could be surrounded by all the great masters. And she said that truly there's no art world like Paris, no painters like the French, and no incentive to do good work equal to that found in a Paris atelier.
The one thing that they did get to see, though, at this Centennial celebration was the unveiling of the Minuteman statue.
Right. So this was a big deal. In 1875, there had been another statue, an obelisk, on the other side of the bridge, which was the British fighting side. But for this event, they wanted a statue representative of the colonists, patriots, on the other side of the bridge, which is where the colonists were fighting. Now, May was a respected artist in town, and a young Daniel Chester French moved from New Hampshire to Concord. He was about 17, and it was actually Daniel's father who approached May Alcott and said, listen, my son has done poorly at MIT, but he seems to have a natural inclination to carving things. Would you please work with him and see if he shows any promise whatsoever? And indeed, she does. She ends up being one of his first teachers. She gives him an introduction to modeling clay. She will give him tools that he will later use on the seated Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. So Emerson was on the Monument Committee, and of course the Alcotts had great influence, and young Daniel Chester French, 22 years old at the time, would create this wonderful Minuteman statue. The citizen farmer represented, quite iconic. So that May's connection with that is significant, that she was a respected artist in town, and Daniel's father approaching her.
That was
And
his
of course,
first major commission.
that was
his first major
right.
commission.
So it's pretty astounding all those connections came together. But I have this wonderful introduction that was written by Daniel Chester French in 1928 in Carolyn Ticknor's memoir about May Alcott. And it's one of the early writings about May. And I just love this. So this is when May came to the house, Daniel Chester French's home, to teach him. One sparkling summer's morning in 1868, a young woman rode into our yard in Concord, Massachusetts, wearing the long skirt and close-fitting bodice, which, with plumed hat, made up the picturesque riding habit of that day, setting off her tall and extraordinarily handsome figure to advantage. This was May Alcott. I recall the impression she made on my mother was one of impatience, for the horse's hooves sadly marred the lawn, but upon me the impression was one of abounding life and health and spirit, which has stayed with me for more than half a century. Her face was not beautiful according to classical standards, but the liveliness of expression and the intelligence and gaiety that shone from it led one to overlook any want of harmony in her features. She wore her wavy chestnut hair, luxuriant and glistening like a crown. An intimate friend said of her, if it were the fashion to go without clothes, May would be considered the most beautiful creature in the world. And I just love that, the sort of the sculpture years later, talking about classical features. And
Yes.
I think it's pretty funny.
And imagining her as just a body,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
She's just a body.
So pretty funny.
So May, excuse me, after that centennial, after 1876, she goes back to Europe to be able to continue studying art.
Right. And she writes a letter home, because this picture that you see in front of you, Fruit and Bottle, a still life, was accepted at the prestigious Paris Salon. And she writes home to tell about that in 1877. Dearest family, I write with good news, and I know my dear Marmy's heart will be delighted to hear that my little picture is accepted at the Great Salon exhibition, where from 8,500 works sent in, only 2,000 were accepted, and mine was thought worthy a place among the best and prominently displayed at eye level. This year, my still life was the only painting accepted by an American woman. To my surprise, my work was selected over that of my friend and fellow artist, Mary Cassatt. Who would have imagined such good fortune and so strong a proof that Lou does not monopolize the Alcott talent? Ha ha, sister, this is the first feather plucked from your cap, and I shall endeavor to fill mine with so many waving in the breeze that you will be quite ready to lay down your pen and rest on your laurels already won. So you can definitely see the competition within this letter. Louisa was thrilled for her, but I love the letter, not only because of her kind of setting the tone for what's coming up for her future, but also the fact that she's mentioning Mary Cassatt, that she was chosen over her. And it's interesting to note that Mary Cassatt told May that you should either pick a career or a family. You can't do both. But May would prove her wrong. And that was very important for May to have a family and a career.
And fascinating too, that this was a conversation women were having in the 1870s.
Exactly. Yes.
They were having these conversations of, can you do both? And that we're still having those conversations.
Right.
So.
And we don't typically think about that, right?
No.
At that
No.
time. But May was very cognizant about that. And she was adamant that that was going to be the case.
And part of her progressive upbringing.
Yes.
So her mother Marmy is very proud of her, but at the time that she is in Europe doing this, Marmy is very sick and is in fact dying. So Louisa tells May not to come home. It's not worth it. We will take care of this for you. She buys this house here. This is the yellow house that had been owned by the Thoreaus, and now the Alcotts. Louisa had purchased it so that Anna and the boys could move into it, and that Marmy would be there. And shortly after they move in, Marmy does die. So she has to sadly send a note to May to let her know, and to let her know that it was fine, that Marmy felt that she was seeing her at the end, and that it was okay. But it's really a very sad time for them.
Yes, it is. And just a little side note, and Henry David Thoreau will end up living there as well.
Yes, it was already the Thoreaus, wasn't it?
Yeah, after that, but that's right. And he died, Thoreau died there actually.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah.
At that house?
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
And this is still in Concord to this
So
day.
you can see it.
it.
So May was fortunately able to find love after the tragic loss of her mother. And she would end up marrying a man 16 years younger than she.
Yes.
So a little progressive there as well. And she'd really found her match with Ernest because, do you have a picture of him? Yeah.
No, I have May, dang, because we're going to talk about Rosa Bonheur.
Oh, we will.
We'll talk about her. We'll come back.
We'll come back to her. So this is Ernest on the left side, and this is a sketch that May did of their parlor outside of Paris. And so Ernest was just the perfect catch, really, because he was a businessman, so he was able to provide, which was important for May. But he was also a violinist. He appreciated May's art, encouraging her. So it was so perfect for them. And she became pregnant, and she gave birth to a little girl in 1879. And she named her Lulu after Louisa. But sadly, 6 weeks after she gave birth, May would die. And the tragedy of that. She was only 39 years old. That's right. So the child would go back to live with Louisa.
Yes. And what's interesting about that is Ernest Nieriker was very much supportive of May having this career and child. The daughter comes back for Louisa to raise. May is actually buried in Paris because at that time you were buried wherever you died. They didn't bring you back here, but there is a stone in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in the family plot, the Alcott family plot, because Louisa wanted to make sure that she was remembered. So I want to go back and talk about this, and then we'll talk about your portrait. And
sure. So this was another portrait that was accepted at the Paris Salon, also in 1879. So all of these things are happening, these successes at the end of May's life. This is entitled Les Negres, and it's been commented on that perhaps because of her progressive upbringing as well, the subject matter for this period, that she does this so eloquently and so elegantly. So it's unusual, and she does a beautiful job, and she's is accepted again into the Paris Salon.
So here's a lovely portrait of May that is done by May's roommate, Rose Peckham. Thank you. There's a lot of R's there. Rose Peckham, who was her roommate and also studying abroad. And she sent it home earlier when it would, Marmee actually really, really loved this portrait. And as you can see, it's a really lovely portrait of her. And it hung on the wall at Orchard House as if it was holding May's place. And Louisa thought it was very ironic after she died that she had sent home, when she sent home this portrait, she sent it with a letter that said, if anything should happen to me, so I never returned to Concord, it is a likeness which I should wish to be remembered by, as it idealizes my bad points and exaggerates my good ones just enough. Mm-hmm. So I love that, actually. So
perfect.
So May's daughter came to be raised by Louisa. She stayed there until Louisa's death about 9 years later. Louisa was also helping Anna to raise her boys and had in fact adopted the youngest boy, because one of the things that Louisa had done was to hold on to the copyrights to her books, including Little Women, so that she could continue to benefit from the income from that and the royalties. So she adopted the youngest Pratt boy so that he could inherit her copyrights and inherit those royalties. But then after she died, little Lulu went back to Europe to be raised by her father's family.
Right, and she was an artist too. And she lived to be 95 years old. Yeah. So another accomplishment for May in the last year of her life was writing this book, Studying Art Abroad and How to Do It Cheaply, which there were certainly travel books written, but this is unique for the period because it's really a how-to for women without means like herself, and encouraging women to pursue an art education. And she tells you where to stay, what classes to take, and she's really advocating for women in this book. Professor and author Julia Dobbs, whose book entitled May Alcott Nieriker, Author and Advocate, says that May sought to transform the art world and social mores through her advocacy for the rights of women to have equal access to a professional artistic career. May says in her guidebook that art is so overtalked and overwritten at the present time, but none of these writers report the actual cost of living, instruction, or rent of studio abroad, or how one in search of such can most easily and economically obtain them in order to realize the desires of one's heart. And it's clear the influence that Louisa's and May's mother had on them. She encouraged her daughters to follow their heart's passion and also empowered them, leading by example, by working, having a career. And in turn, both Louisa and May followed this course and found success. In the process of empowering themselves, they also desired to help others, and in their own ways advocated for women to have equal rights. They left a lasting legacy of not only their own work, but of empowering others to realize the desires of their heart.
So that's what we have, guys. I'd love to hear any questions, comments, etc.
Oh my goodness, that was amazing. Lots of great comments in chat, just about how engaging this presentation was. There were a handful of questions that did come in. Just a reminder, folks, please use the Q&A feature. It's the option right next to chat to ask your questions. But the first question that came in was, who did the painting? Do you actually know who did which painting in the beginning of the?
Oh,
No.
the Turner one?
I had them labeled and then somehow I don't, but and they looked,
Okay.
I will tell you though, they look, I couldn't tell the difference side by side.
They look so similar. I'm going to see if I can find, here's May's. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I don't know. Here, let me see if I can find the other one. So yeah, I don't know that I can show you that because they literally look so similar that
Awesome.
you can't tell.
Well, that was one of the burning questions that was in chat, and then they made it to Q&A. There were some speculations from the group. So if there's
I think the one on the right was May's, actually.
Awesome. Another question that came in was, who was the $7,000 check given to?
So I don't know the kid's name. But that was one of the boys who was the inspiration for Lori. There were two. One was
Let's pull a lot.
Alfie.
Yeah,
Alvin Ladislo?
Let's go. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was the other one, L. The guy began with L.
Okay, so it was
Names
given to
are not mine,
Ladislo
yeah.
Wadaliski, maybe?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was the one who got the $7,000 check.
Perfect.
Just felt it was important to honor the fact that he had inspired her. But it was really a combination of those two guys.
Gotcha. Another really good question that came in was, if they were so poor, how were they able to go to Europe to study? Where did the money come from to pay the rent, etc.? I guess, yeah.
All Louisa's book.
Early on, it was interesting. Early on, Abba came from the Sewell family. So they were a very well-known, prominent family in Boston. And when they discovered that Bronson could not pay their taxes, etc., they were so horrified by this and so shamed that they prepaid the Alcott's taxes going forward so that they helped them. The money, like I think it was Alice Bartlett who helped to fund that first trip to Europe. And after that, the subsequent, this is why Louisa, she took in she was a seamstress, she was a nanny, she was a writer, she performed and wrote in plays. She did whatever it took to make money, because prior to that, it was really just, by the skin of their teeth that they were able to support themselves. And it was mostly Abba working as a social worker, taking in sewing, doing whatever she could, because they really, Bronson Alcott's idea was that Providence would provide. And there is a story about him, I guess it's like March, and a beggar comes by and asks if he can have firewood. He says he really needs firewood. And Bronson says, of course, and gives him half of their firewood. And Abba is like, seriously, are you kidding me? We need that. And he's like, nah, it'll be fine. And then 2 days later, there's a blizzard, right? And a man hauling a firewood into Boston gets stuck. And so he stops and drops it with the Alcotts. So, when something like that happens, you're like, oh, so this is what happens. It just reinforces him.
But Louisa was also getting money from she was writing before Little Women.
Oh, yeah.
So she was getting some money too from that as well. And she actually wrote under a pen name A.M. Barnard. She wrote these kind of pot boiler stories. So she was actively, getting money right along, but it was just that 1868's publication of Little Women really took care of all the family's debts.
Gotcha. And now I guess this will probably be one of our last, we'll see, last of two questions. Which film version did you like the best?
So it's interesting you should ask that, because the last year when the Concord Players did their decennial version of Little Women, they ran a month-long program, and they ran four of the movies, including the 1932 one, the one in the 40s, like the one with Katharine Hepburn, and then the Winona Ryder one, and then the latest one. I personally like the latest one, because the Greta Gerwig version, because it's a different version of Little Women, and it gives you things from Louisa's point of view. So it's more that whole story. But I know a lot of people prefer the Winona Ryder version.
I think I like the older versions better.
Really,
personally.
the Katharine Hepburn?
More traditional. Yeah.
They're a little overdone for me.
A little bit, but yeah.
I'll just say.
Yeah.
There we go. Almost like sisters there, huh?
Yeah.
The last question: how close were May and Lizzie?
Man,
In terms of age?
just or their relationship.
Relationship.
That's kind of hard to say. It's interesting because in the book, it makes Beth seem like she's like a baby, but she was actually 22 when she dies. They got scarlet fever, Beth and May recovered, but Lizzie got, complications from that caught up with her. I think she was close with her probably initially, but I think it's hard to say. I don't really get a strong feeling either way. I think it's kind of neutral.
I think the sisters were all very close, but I
but
think after Lizzie died, that bond between Louisa and May definitely became stronger, because they had a lot in common. They were both career women. They were both following these creative passions. They were similar in a lot of ways. But I think before that, everything that you read shows that they were a pretty close family, and that those sisters absolutely loved each other.
Wonderful. Well, we've reached our time, but I want to say thank you so much for this wonderful presentation today. You all did an amazing job, and it seems like the crowd has really, taken away something new, from being early trendsetters with being vegans and being, forward progressive thinkers. So thank you. If you, for folks who attended this presentation today, again, it was recorded, and we will be sharing that with you following the program today. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you so
you.
much.